All right, we understand the fundamentals now, and we want to whip this thing out and play with it. How do we do that? That's called the draw. It looks like this. Just like everything else, there's a few different ways to draw your handgun. There's also a buttload of different holsters to secure your firearm on various parts of your body. For the most part, we're going to be covering outside the waistband open top holsters in this course, but we are going to be brushing over retention holsters as well as some concealed carry options for appendix as well. Whether in a competition context or real world, the draw is extremely important to be quick at. It's likely one of the most important skills to be quick at. An average shooter can output about 4 rounds in a second. If you look at the professional side of the house, they're getting about 6 rounds per second. In the competition realm, being behind by half a second loses you the match. In a real world context, if you are half a second behind someone, they've likely already launched 2 to 3 bullets at you, meaning you might not even be able to play the game. Obviously, proactive threat assessment and awareness takes top priority, but if it comes to drawing your pistol, a 2-second draw versus a 1-second draw is extremely significant. To drive that point home, let's watch some videos together. These concepts are why our draw and first round on target is vital. Mastering our first and final grip leads to everything else. So depending on your goals and your firearm usage, the draw might go from very highly important to highly important. In terms of the priority of training the draw, I like to borrow a phrase from jiu-jitsu: position before submission. If we can't safely and efficiently draw our pistol quickly, then in some contexts, we might not even be able to take a shot. First, we're going to run through outside the waistband holsters with no retention. We're going to try not to overcomplicate this into 5, 6, 7 steps, because that's out there and it can lead to a pretty inefficient and choppy draw. That being said, when we're starting out on our draws, we really want to think through the whole process of getting the gun out of the holster and onto target, but it's one process. We are going to make this very quick later in the course, but remember, first comes right, then comes fast. Looking at the way that my holster's set up on my hip right now, it appears that my holster is a little bit forward of the center of my hip. And that's because that's where my hands want to fall. Not only is my firearm a little bit forward, but it also has a tiny bit of negative cant. Again, we want to avoid our shoulder moving unnecessarily to access our handgun. And the reason for that is because my wrist and arm like to line up at that position. Sometimes you'll see a very aggressive forward cant on law enforcement and military rigs because they have so much gear on the front of their belts that are weighing their holster down and tilting their firearm forward. The next thing to think about is our hand position. Now, situation dictates, but if possible, in any context, try to come up with an index point for your hands. Whether that's an interview stance or a martial arts fence, try to find some position on your body that your hands can remain as close as possible so that they know where your holster is in relation to them. That will provide us a very quick and efficient draw in a static environment, but remember, we should also be training in different hand positions and in different body positions because our holster will move depending on those. In a competition setting, there's a multitude of starting hand positions. Most commonly, you'll see surrender position or relaxed. In most of the hand positions, we can find an index point that will assist us in the draw. For instance, for the relaxed stance, I've chewed out a small portion of my holster here where I can index my thumb to ensure that my hand is in the same spot for every draw. This also assists in getting that first and final grip that we talked about in the grip series. The first and final grip is even more important when it comes to the draw because of the velocity of the gun coming out of the holster. We need to ensure that we're controlling that thing and not tossing it into a crowd of people. So the first step in any draw, regardless of the holster, is obtaining that first and final grip. We want to ensure from any hand position that we're not using unnecessary movements. For instance, if I start in a relaxed stance, I don't want my hand to come up to here before I come down and obtain that first and final grip. All I need to do is as much movement as is necessary to clear my thumb over the backstrap of the pistol and get that first and final grip. Once we've got this first and final grip, all we're going to do is lift the firearm out of the holster and up at the same time. If we only go up, we're wasting movement because now we have to go out. So what we want to try to do with our first and final grip is pull up and out at the same time so the firearm comes out on a diagonal line towards the target. A way to think about this is to ensure there's a little bit of tension on the front of your holster as the firearm's coming out. What that will do, I'm building pressure on the front, and as it clears the holster, it wants to fly out and slingshot towards the target. As opposed to the normal method of directly up and then forward. Once the gun's out of the holster, I need to marry it up to my support hand. Now I need to do that at some point before full extension. I don't want to do it out here because I'm going to muzzle myself and I'm not going to have time to finalize my grip before I get to full extension. To expedite this, we want to ensure that our support hand is ready to accept the pistol, meaning that I'm already forming my support hand in that puzzle piece that's going to complete the grip. This is a difficult thing to index because if we place it too close to the body and try to index it on the nipple line like some shooters do, that creates an inefficiency because our firearm's already out here. You can make an index point with your support hand if you're doing the old school 20,000 step draw, which would be gripping the pistol, clearing the holster, canting the firearm towards the target, acquiring the grip, and then getting to full extension and aiming. A good point of reference I've found for most shooters is the place where they clap their hands. So if I were to be clapping out here and I draw my pistol, this is the position that I want to leave my hand in. So knowing that this is the end point that we want to get to, all we have to do to get there is draw that diagonal line from the holster to our full extension point, which looks like this. It's as easy as reholstering your pistol. I'm just going to pause this real quick and show you how good I am at drawing to give some definitions. This is the tuck position or compressed ready position where the gun is around the nipple line. This is low ready where the arms are at full extension but at about a 45-degree angle to provide maximum visibility and awareness. This is high ready, which is a hybrid between the readiness and visibility. The gun is just below eye level and your vision is looking over the sights onto the target with no sight picture, but the sights are in view. And this is aiming down the sights at full extension. My hands basically did the exact same thing there in reverse. That's the most efficient way of moving my gun to the full extension point, drawing that diagonal line up to the target and marrying my hand where I clap. Now, what is full extension? This is different for everyone. My full extension is right here. This is where my hands are relaxed. For some shooters, full extension can be even this close. On the other extreme, we have shooters pushing past that relaxed state and getting into that little bit of a turtle mode. Find an extension where your sight picture comes naturally and there's the least amount of tension in your body. For me, when I'm at this point, my muscles aren't pushing and they're not pulling. Now, we want to get to this position as fast as possible without hitting the wall. And what I mean by the wall is if I'm coming up into a draw at 100% speed and I don't apply the brakes quickly enough, I'm going to overshoot my full extension, which looks like this. You can see there's a wobble at the end. When I go past my full extension and hit it, my arms kind of rebound and come back. I don't want that. That slows down my sight picture acquisition. What we want to try to do is to move our hands as quickly as possible to the holster and then quickly as possible from the holster to about the 80 to 90% mark. At this point, we want to quickly apply the brakes and come to a screeching halt at our full extension. You can see the difference between these two techniques. When you're going 100% out of the holster all the way to full extension and sometimes past it, you'll get a little bit of a wobble. On the contrary, if we can apply our brakes before hitting that wall or full extension, we'll notice that our sight picture is already relaxed and stable when it comes into view. During the draw with an iron-sighted system, we want to try to grab that front sight in our vision as the gun is moving up into our field of view and align it with our rear notch. This of course depends on the context of the shooting scenario. Like we talked about in the previous lessons, sometimes you'll be keeping an entirely target-focused approach, and sometimes you'll want that front sight clearly in view if you're landing a precision round. During the draw with an optic system, we're not going to change our focal point. We're going to keep our eyes downrange on our target and let our optic meet up with our eyes. One thing that we do want to ensure when we're marrying our hands is that it starts from this point and back, not from the palm and forward. For instance, if I were to marry my hands palm first and then fingers, I've lost some of the friction that I would gain if I started at my index finger on the trigger guard and pushed into it on the extension. Feel the difference in these two grips if you take your fist out and start at your fingertips, wrapping around and pushing, versus starting here and wrapping around and pushing. And you'll feel if you start with your fingertips, the spaces between your fist and your hand close more naturally and tightly than if you were to start on your palm and push into it. So that's the draw. Again, we do not want to overcomplicate this. It is one movement. The draw is one process in your brain, getting the gun out of your holster and putting it to full extension. Now at the start, we do want to kind of break this down. For instance, finding your first and final grip from any hand position is a good drill. So starting from relaxed position, coming up and getting my first final grip, interview, surrender, and just finding where your pistol is in relation to your body. And just for the giggles, try to switch your hip position at some point too. It kind of screws with your brain and it helps us build that awareness of where our pistol is in relation to our appendages. Some of the things that people really like to talk about with drawing is the fishing and the bowling. You actually don't really see these very often at all unless the person is just picking up the gun for the first time. And because I just showed you those, you'll never do them. Another advanced option we have for the draw on outside the waistband holsters, which are open top with no retention, is called the scoop draw. This is primarily a competition use draw because the consistency of obtaining that first and final grip can be a little bit dodgy. It looks like this. So you can see my hands are scooping the pistol and lifting it out of the holster before my thumb has slid over to the other side and obtained a first and final grip. My grip is actually fully obtained right when my gun clears the holster, instead of before it clears the holster. Now this will save about 0.25 seconds off your draw, but you need to figure out in terms of your context and your goals if that's worth it for you or not, in terms of your first and final grip maybe not being as spot on as you would like. When it comes to reholstering, we need to ensure a couple things happen before our gun gets into the holster. The first being that our hands move together as a unit. If I leave my support hand out here, what can happen is I muzzle my hand. I need to ensure that my hands move back towards my chest together, and now my support hand stays at my chest. I don't want to come down here and mess with my holster or move my belt to get my gun in because I end up flagging my hand. Another thing we should ensure when we're starting out is that we look at our holster. You're not going to win any cool guy awards by looking out here or talking to someone while you're trying to find your holster. Just take that second that you need to look down and put your gun away in the holster. There are very few scenarios where you need to rush your gun back into the holster. So take your time doing that, do it properly and safely. In fact, the only thing I can really think of would be in a law enforcement context where your firearm's out and you need to switch to another use of force option. Lastly, we want to ensure that our trigger finger is dramatically off the firearm before we reholster. Otherwise, you can run into situations like this, which have occurred, where the holster is pushing your finger into the trigger. This is also a visual redundancy for me to ensure that my finger is off the trigger and I'm not doing something stupid like this. As an added bonus with our finger coming off, we can also place our thumb on the back of the slide. This ensures that the slide is not going to be pushed out of battery when the gun is reholstered. And technically it could remain out of battery when you redraw your firearm, meaning on presentation, your trigger will not work. If we try to go quickly through the draw when we're starting out, before we have that smooth, efficient draw, what can happen is you'll develop choppy moments in the draw as you move through it. For instance, you can slow down on your first and final grip, you can slow down at the marrying point. Putting a lengthy timer on the draw, such as 5, 6, 7 seconds, ensures that we're making it efficient from the start to the end. If you have a lengthy draw time, you can ensure that all these steps have no interruptions, but that you have plenty of time to accomplish them. And then you can incrementally speed up as you find that there's no interruptions in your draw and all the positions that you need to get to are being attained fully. And then once your draw is efficient and consistent, so there's no choppy or interrupted phases of your draw, then you can speed it up and drop a second or two off and see if you can find some more choppiness or some hang-ups there. With retention holsters, we're going to keep basically all the same principles. The only difference is going to be that our first and final grip takes a little bit longer to acquire because we have to defeat those retention mechanisms. Now I'm not going to go through deactivating all the locking mechanisms or retention devices on every holster on the market. The principles are pretty similar across the board on most of the major holsters. This is a Safariland 6360 RDS. It has a self-locking system as well as an automatic locking system below it, the SLS and the ALS. On many retention holsters, the hood is deactivated in a forward motion, meaning that we don't want our holster in a position where our hand has to go past the hood and then come forward to disengage it. We're going to go off on a quick tangent here with a little tip that's going to make you more consistent drawing from a level 3 retention holster like this. We want to ensure when we're doing our draws that we're sweeping down the grip and pushing into the hood with a nice erected thumb, like so. Once that hood gets pushed down, our thumb should be in a good natural position to deactivate the ALS so that all the retention is defeated in the holster. We push down a little bit deeper into the holster to ensure all of that retention is defeated, and then we can draw that diagonal line from the holster, dragging the front sight out and sweeping to the target. If you try to index your first and final grip directly down on top of the grip like so, instead of sweeping, what can happen, my thumb reaches the hood, and now my thumb has to do an extra movement on its own, pushing forward to get the hood down and then deactivate the ALS. What you'll tend to see happen if you come directly down on top of that hood is your thumb will sometimes push into the holster downwards instead of forwards as it's supposed to, creating a little bit more tension on this hood that's supposed to be driving forward, not down. So we're either asking our hand and our thumb to stay rigid and push the bail forward on the entry down the grip, or we're asking our thumb to come down and index directly on top of the grip of the pistol and the hood, and then do an extra motion of pushing and flicking the hood down, which you can see is a lot more difficult. This problem can get even worse if you start getting a gritty hood because of dirt inside the mechanism. So we want to ensure that this is clean and nice and oiled so that it releases freely and easily. Now, when we talk about sweeping down the grip and defeating those retention devices, obviously the angle of our grip inside the holster does make a difference. That's why negative cant plates such as this exist, to give the shooter the ability to rotate the holster and adjust the cant to their preference. This is preferential to a degree. I actually tend to enjoy a little bit of positive cant on my firearm in retention holsters. For me, with retention rigs like this, I find that that positive cant can help me guide my hand down into the hood and sweep down the grip a little bit easier and more consistently. There's a lot of shooters that prefer a negative cant so that their firearm is level on their belt or even a little bit dipped further. Since these plates came out that assist shooters in getting that negative cant, this does seem to be a little bit more of the standard now, is at least leveling out the grip on the belt or pushing it down. Experiment with all these options and find what is most consistent and quick for you. You'll see when I toss this on my belt that the holster is a little bit further forward than the middle of my hip, and you can see that positive cant. Again, experiment with both of these options, the cant as well as the location on your hip. I've found for me, this moving to the positive cant setup has taken about 0.1 to 0.15 off of my total draw time, but again, experiment with both options. Now that time advantage could entirely be placebo because I've been running negative cant for about 2 years, and now that I've just switched to the positive cant setup, I'm shaving off again, like I said, around that 0.15 off of my total draw time. That could just be being excited about the new position or a bunch of Red Bull. Who knows? Outside of defeating the retention on the holster, the principles of the draw remain the same. We get our first and final grip, we drag in a diagonal line to our full extension, and we marry our hands where we're clapping. One thing we lose the ability to do with a retention holster is a scoop draw. We can't do that because the retention device is in the holster. Now, that doesn't mean we can't start our hand in a relaxed position. This actually gives us a little bit of an index point and a benefit because all we need to do is slide up and our hand can go right over top to the retention device. I've made an index point in this holster as well, and my forearm sits on the back strap of the grip. That's a perfect index point for me to come up and get my first and final grip immediately. If we're running a retention holster, the context is likely that we are protecting our firearm from people, in the same sense that we need to have our hands up to defend against strikes and grabs. So my support hand stays up on a plate carrier or radio, right in my pec region, and that's ready to marry up to the firearm. I still have the ability to defend or push away, and at the same time draw my firearm. The benefit to this system is that it's non-confrontational. We don't have our hand on our firearm, it's simply sitting on an index point on our holster so we can access it quickly. The other hand is ready to defend or push away, and we can still get to our gun extremely quickly. If you're carrying a firearm for duty or defense, it's a good habit to access your first and final grip from time to time if you're in a safe area away from people. Because obtaining that initial grip on the firearm is the hardest part of the draw, it's a good thing to practice from time to time in various positions, various hand positions throughout the day. Another slight change that people like to implement with retention holsters is to push a little bit deeper into the holster to ensure that the retention buttons are completely deactivated before pulling up. For instance, when I get my first and final grip, I'm applying force directly down into the holster to ensure that all the buttons are deactivated and I have a good grip before I draw out. Obtaining the first and final grip is the same thing as when we did it before without a holster. We want to ensure that we're getting deep, high up on the tang, and that the fat of our hand is enveloping that grip. At this point, we should already start applying that pinching grip as we draw the gun out. Now remember, because of variable hand pressure, we don't need to be vice gripping this thing until we get it to full extension and we're preparing to shoot. There are many points in a competition or real-world context where you'll draw your pistol minutes or even sometimes hours before prepping to fire. We want to be efficient with our grip and our muscles because we're going to need that when the time comes. Conceal carry. We're going to quickly brush over conceal carry, and it's going to be the same principles whether that's appendix, 3 o'clock, small to back, that doesn't matter. The same principles are going to apply from the outside the waistband all the way through. We're just going to have a few little things to touch on here, specifically to appendix carry as well. I'm also not going to get into printing of the firearm, which refers to seeing where the firearm is hidden on the body, specifically because this is different for every body type, holster, and firearm, and the goal. For instance, in a deep concealment context, I'm less concerned about the draw speed of the firearm than I am the firearm being found out, which is why holsters like this exist. That's a full-size Glock 17 with an optic. With concealed carry, the added step that we have to look out for is clearing the cover garment, which is the garment that's covering our firearm, which is kind of like clearing the retention buttons on our holster. To get our first and final grip, we have to do one little extra step to get that. There's a couple different ways to clear this cover garment. Some people start from the bottom in a sweeping motion, others start from the center in a grabbing motion, and then there's the cheater style where we're already holding the shirt. I tend to subscribe to the center grab. So I take my support hand, grabbing the center of my shirt, and pull it to the opposite armpit. That gives me nice clearance to come down and get my first and final grip on my firearm. And once I've accessed and cleared the firearm from the holster, I can release the shirt and get my full grip to full extension. At speed, the appendix draw looks very similar to the outside the waistband draw as we already discussed. Now on reholstering for a concealed carry rig, we have one extra consideration we need to remember, and that is to look into the holster. We want to ensure that our undershirt or underwear aren't inside the holster and are going to obstruct the holster or snag on the trigger when we're reinserting the firearm. Remember, there's rarely a rush to reholster a firearm, so take your time, look into the holster. It's clear. My index finger is dramatically off the frame of the pistol. My thumb is pushed behind the slide, and I can reinsert it. Once I've cleared my cover garment, one thing that people do is they like to push their hips forward to ensure that they get a little bit more space behind the grip and the skin to wedge their hand into. Now, another way you can do this is just to skip the thumb, kind of like a scoop draw on an outside the waistband holster. I come up with my 4 fingers and grab, and just like I'm reholstering the firearm, I put my thumb on the back of the slide. I clear the holster, and then once I've cleared it, when I'm extending away from my body, I finish my grip. I marry my hand, and I extend to full extension. Again, across all these holsters, our techniques and principles have remained largely the same. All we're doing, simplify it, get that first and final grip, and draw a diagonal line from your holster to your full extension, and get it there as quick as possible.